Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited for this conversation. We are here with Shalanda Young, Budget Director for the Biden administration and the United States of America. And we're going to dive in, and we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about the state of the world. And then we're also going to open it up and welcome questions from all you. Welcome to Aspen.
Thank you so much. I was just saying, these are very exposed seats here. So I'm usually a skirts and dresses lady at the office. Pants are not my friend usually. For women who will understand that, it's hard for us to get the right size. So I dressed for the occasion. So I did not have a viral moment. I was very exposed. That would not be okay for the budget woman. Okay?
We can hope for a different kind of
I don't need it. I signed the order to ban TikTok from government phones. I don't need to become viral on TikTok because my dress did something.
So is the name of our panel Biden's secret weapon, or is that just what you've been called? I can't remember.
Someone may have said it somewhere.
Yeah. The problem with being called a secret weapon is then you're kind of no longer a secret weapon, right? You're as well known. So here's what I want to start with. We live in a time where people talk about how horribly polarized the United States is, how the two parties are so far apart that Washington is gridlocked and can't get anything done. That's a very well-known notion, right? We hear it so often. And yet, you just referred to TikTok, right? The legislation on TikTok was bipartisan legislation, right? Whatever people think of it, if you agree with it or disagree with it, you should ask a question about it. The legislation on Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel and the Palestinian aid was bipartisan legislation. The budget deals that you've been central to have been bipartisan. The infrastructure deal that Mitch Landrieu talks so much about was bipartisan. The CHIPS bill was bipartisan. We have seen President Biden keep some of President Trump's trade policies and expand them and alter them, but basically there is kind of a bipartisan nature to it. And so several weeks ago, my editors came to me and said, we keep hearing that the country is gridlocked, and yet we also keep reporting on all this bipartisan legislation. What explains that? So now I'm going to ask you that question. We keep hearing the country is gridlocked, and yet all this legislation keeps getting done. What explains that?
I mean, I think sometimes when people vote for bipartisan legislation, they also then have to cover themselves in some other partisan rhetoric. So we sometimes tend to hear more, and you have me speaking, the NASA administrator who's a senator, so I feel bad like talking about Congress without acknowledging Bill Nelson's here who served there. And I often tell him on NASA is one of our bipartisan accomplishments we get done every year. Members of both parties want to do it. There's more. I call it the governing majority. I'm sure other people have other names for Ukraine funding. Why are you optimistic? Like, very frustrating. It took 9 months. Frustrating from a personal standpoint because my life was wrapped up in having the same conversations with people. Like, what do you need to explain why our foreign policy depends on this, and they had to get their politics straight. But this governing majority, I've always believed in it, probably because I self-selected. I think you end up in jobs that like fit your personality. So I probably have a personal affinity towards like trying to get stuff done. I don't enjoy talking about stuff and not seeing something come to fruition. I'd feel some people that's great. Like, everyone has a role in this democracy. I love advocates who are like as rough on us. They believe in the agenda, but they give us more crap, I think, sometimes than they give Republicans. That's their role in this democratic, and they probably do push us to places where, uncomfortableness sets in. But that's their role. And the more you respect everyone's role in this great experiment, I bring all this back because I probably work for the president of the most foreign policy experience in recent memory. All of these little things, whether we can get Ukraine done, whether we can fund the government, whether we can lift the debt ceiling, comes back to, does democracy work? Is she right in China that our system is played out, can't continue? You need authoritarians to make quick decisions, not have a Congress like throw the Constitution out? Or can we, through these small bipartisan wins, prove that, hey, you're wrong, China. We don't need to suppress personal freedoms. We don't need to have authoritarianism like rule the day. Democracy still works. So I'm going to continue to have some faith in that. I think people are right. I'm not ignorant to the fact that the rhetoric, in my view, is out of control. But I also like to remind people to look behind it. You do have a bipartisan infrastructure law. You do have a chips and science law, which is bringing chips manufacturing back to this country. This country developed chips technology, and we saw other countries run with manufacturing, and no one thought anything of it until, guess what? You couldn't buy a car. And most of that was down to there were not enough chips available. On the pandemic, more Americans know about supply chains than I ever thought about. So that's just, I probably ended up in this job because I am one who likes, after 9-10 months of like banging heads, getting to stand up with people I banged heads with for 3 or 4 months to say, we got something done.
What's interesting to me is that it seems to me a lot of the areas where we have had bipartisan compromise, and to be clear, there are obviously a bunch of areas where there's no concept.
It'll never happen.
Right? Like, we're not getting a bipartisan abortion bill at any point, in the foreseeable future. But it seems to me that 2 areas, sometimes overlapping, where we've really have had some bipartisan agreement is a mixture of foreign policy and economic policy. And I want to bounce 2 explanations off you for that to let you react and tell me if you think it's wrong. So you've already mentioned one of them, which is China, right? So part of what happened with semiconductors was we had COVID and we said, wait a second, what if we can't get semiconductors? We also realized, wait a second, an unbelievable share of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan.
Yep.
That could be a problem at some point, right? And so it does seem to me that some of this bipartisan legislation reflects a shared consensus, not among everyone in both parties. The Republican Party has a big isolationist wing. There are obviously foreign policy tensions in the Democratic Party. But there is a greater recognition that the United States is now in a global competition with a sort of emerging alliance. China at the center, also includes Russia, also includes Iran, sometimes includes North Korea. Do you think that's right? And when you're on the Hill talking to people, do you think it's part of what makes them want to get to a deal?
I think you're right, but I look at it from a different way. I've been surprised that it's been this hard to get those done. Because when I started on the Hill, you didn't have to convince people China was we had to beat them to the race on science and technology. And certainly, I joked with some of my Republican friends, like, I've never worked so hard to convince you to buy weapons in my life. Like, what is happening? Like, what? So yes, I agree, but I've been surprised how hard it is to convince, frankly, a party that has been known, and it discounts Democrats' commitment to national security, because you also usually don't have to convince Democrats very hard to invest in our Defense Department, our national defense. So I agree with the proposition you put out, but I've been surprised that there are so many people who've gone the isolationist route who we've had to convince, because our foreign policy used to be the unifying thing, and our domestic priorities that tied into that, like our economic policy, like our trade policy, like our chips manufacturing, our science, our competitive nature on the world stage. Yes, that makes all the sense in the world. I've just been surprised how hard it is to convince some people.
Why do you think there is a rising isolationist wing in the Republican Party?
I don't do the political side. I stay out of that. So it's hard to answer that without, I think, talking about the politics of the day. And it's just hard to ignore. Politicians don't stay. I've never worked on the political side, never run a campaign, always on the policy side, but I work for a lot of politicians. I get them after they win their election. And I come to DC and try to squash bad ideas they said to get elected, or try to make them become reality, and turn them into good public policy. And people in DC to get there, don't say things that don't resonate with people. So there's something there they're hearing from the electorate. I don't think they're coming to DC and changing what they've said. I do know I started in DC working for a member from northern Wisconsin. Probably won't be a Democrat who represents that area for the rest of my lifetime. He won with 52%, 53% every 2 years.
Who is he?
Dave Obey.
Yep.
And who I respect and love, and learned everything I know about funding the government from him. and his values. And he had to find compromise to get elected. If you run in primaries and speak to the most extreme, to get reelected and to speak about the constituents that sent you there, what benefit is there to find compromise? You are there representing the people mostly responsible for sending you. So, it's hard to speak about the policy downfalls without having a conversation about what is going on in the country and who our policymakers are hearing from and why they feel comfortable having some of these isolationist, viewpoints. And there's something going on, but it's not necessarily just with politicians. They are hearing from constituents, and I take them at their word. I think they're representing their constituents. So what is going on there? What effect is gerrymandering having is it creating an echo effect? Is it really not as much going on in a change, or we not listening to a diverse group, especially I'm talking mostly House members? Or they're not hearing from a large swath because these districts are drawn in such a way they don't. So I think a lot about that. I don't have the answer, but I hope political scientists are looking at this. I don't think you can fix the policy ills without talking about what's going on in American politics. And at least for now, I'd like to not get into ethics jail and hashtag jails and pontificate on some of the reasons I think our politics are where they are.
Before we get to the second explanation, let me ask you about another part of this foreign policy kind of global rivalry. Because I really do think the United States is now in a very substantial competition with the countries I just mentioned. Whether you call it a new Cold War or whatever you want to call it. And so there's a rising isolationist wing in the Republican Party that I just asked about. I also think there's some discomfort on the political left with the idea of patriotism and the idea of the importance of the United States. Your boss, President Biden, has none of that discomfort, right?
At all.
He's deeply patriotic. He quotes Madeleine Albright, the indispensable nation. But I really do think there are large parts of the Democratic coalition, particularly on the left, that are uncomfortable with the idea that the United States is an indispensable nation, right? You see on college campuses, people cheer when American flags come down. You look at polling data, the group that is least likely to say the United States is the greatest country in the world is highly educated Democrats. And so I'm interested in whether, when you talk about outside advocates pressuring you all, there's healthy kinds of pressure and there are less healthy kinds of pressure. Do you worry at all that the political left is uncomfortable with the idea that the United States is an indispensable nation, as your boss says, and has a crucial role to play in making the world a better place?
So I've worked with members, I think we call them the squad.
Yes.
In the House, on a personal level, frankly, I do think they think America has a role in foreign policy. Do they agree with what that role is? No. But that is a difference from thinking America should pull back versus what our policy is. To me, that there is an inherent difference from where they are versus those who think America should mind its own business and only care about what happens on our shores. And I think it's a healthy thing to have a discussion about what our foreign policy should be and what our interventions should be. And I've never heard any of them speak about not intervening. They just disagree with some of the ways and some of the assistance we provided. And frankly, if we can't have a debate about that, what are we doing?
Yep.
We should be able to have that conversation. Things have changed. When I started in DC 20 years ago, we have a different thought about where they are. I've heard stuff, bipartisan board. I know it's a joke, but hell, I've been here long enough to know don't discount anything. I didn't think we get a child tax credit.
Yeah.
2 years ago, still fighting to get it back. So I'm a big believer you keep putting thoughts out. That's why there's a healthy role for everybody. And I'm a big believer in incremental change. Some people never satisfied, go for the big thing. I'm like, don't discount incremental. You take the win today, you keep fighting around. Some people dislike that, but that's like my bread and butter. Yeah. Like, what can you get today or tomorrow? I'll take it. Thank you so very much. And not everyone's that, but you explain, you go into, I also don't try to upsell people or sell them on where this is what it is. I was in the room. This is all we can get. Did you try this? It's also human nature. Everybody thinks they can do a better job than you did when you negotiated something. Couldn't you have gotten this?
And it's actually really interesting when you read political history and you think about the most effective presidents and politicians we've had, and honestly, outside protest leaders, they all share that sense that you just said, which is they share this idea that we're going to push and push and push and push, and then we're going to take what we got, right? I mean, it's true of Abraham Lincoln. It's true of FDR. Reagan has some amazing quotes where he's like, these right-wing nuts aren't willing to take anything but the perfect deal. I want to take what we can get, right? Ronald Reagan. And I once heard Barack Obama do this great riff in which he said, you know what's underrated? Better. Better is underrated, right? Which is like a really good line.
Yeah. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Not a boss who repeated that over and over and over.
And in a democracy, there's a way in which you're actually kind of disrespecting the rest of the democracy if you say, I'll take only one. So let's talk about what I think is the second explanation and give you a chance to kind of reflect on that. And again, disagree with it if you do. We followed a set of policies in this country for the last 40 or 50 years that were very market-oriented. They were based on the idea that the government went too far from the 40s to the 70s, and the government was going to pull back, right? Laissez-faire, neoliberalism, you kind of pick your phrase. The idea, the promises that were made were that if we lower taxes and shrink labor unions and increase immigration and decrease regulation,
it will all trickle down.
Everyone will do well. And it was more of a Republican idea, but a lot of Democrats embraced it as well. The trade deals were bipartisan deals. And it really hasn't worked out that well for huge numbers of Americans. Look at income, look at wealth, look at how happy people are, look at life expectancy. The United States now has the lowest life expectancy in the world of any rich country, and it's not that close. So it just hasn't worked out that well. And I think, although Democrats and Republicans come at it from very different perspectives, to me, we see parts of both parties really starting to question what was the neoliberal consensus. Yeah. And I think you see that in infrastructure and trade and chips and industrial policy. And I know it makes some people uncomfortable, but it really feels like what we had in the past wasn't working that well. And I'm interested whether you think that that is a partial explanation, even if I haven't framed it quite right.
Yeah, I'd add unionization to that. You see Republicans flirting with some embrace of unions. Clearly the president believes in the power of unions to lift people up and have, 4-year college isn't for everybody. But you should be able to take care of your family even if that was not the avenue for you. And by God, we need workers, and they should feel protected. One other thing this president has done, I think Democrats have frankly run away from, that he is not running away from. He's being very muscular, is tax policy. Don't come and tell me we have a fiscal problem if you're not willing to talk about revenues. And I've about had enough of people wanting to fix our fiscal problems on the back of people who need government most. Just like you can spin your way out, you can't tax your way. Like, we all have our rhetoric around it, but you can't talk about fiscal without having a tax conversation. And he's put out budgets. Frankly, I've never seen Democrats be so muscular about putting out tax policy that, and that tax policy makes the argument you're making. It ain't fair. Something is not fair in this country. And we're getting more and more wealth disparity, and some of us feel it is a detriment to the future. The president always makes a joke, but he's not wrong. I don't dislike wealthy people or rich people. Three yachts is great. Maybe 2 if it helps the whole country. It's not the worst sentiment. What happened? We also in this country have a history of what the greater good. What helps people? If the little guy does well, maybe everybody can do well economically or do better than they've been doing now. So I do think there is a swing to in this. We talk about it in a fairness, what is fair, and a lot of people in this country don't feel like they're getting a fair shake. Whether you're voting for Republicans or Democrats, both parties are coming at it from different ways, but there's something core to both their sets of core constituencies that are feeling the same thing. We have a different way of approaching it. But I think it's a very troubling thing when a large group of Americans aren't feeling great about having children, what life their children have in front of them, just overall unease about their ability to have the American dream. And, you know, again, it's not all solved in a revenue conversation, but I've been very proud to be a part of this fairness exercise. What is fair? And we need to do something about this. And again, I think we call it different things, and each party like sells their version. But I think they're tapping into a feeling amongst a lot of Americans that the system we have it's not working for everyone. Look, we've seen been a lot of conversations about prices and what that does to people's feelings, especially with interest rates. And that is all fair, but wealth has also gone up more than inflation. And I've tried to find, every time I'm in one of these people, like, why aren't people feeling it? Like, I'm not here to tell people how to feel. There is clearly something, but I think it's larger than just inflation and interest rates now. It is something that has been, I think, a growing feeling that something is not right, and people aren't getting a fair shake in this country. And a lot of our policies are meant to show people, we hear you, we're trying to get to the crux of the problem. And I think, frankly, Republicans know there's a sentiment out there, too. They're just trying it from a different side.
So you obviously have substantive disagreements with Republicans on the Hill. They also have a lot of respect for you. I mean, one of the things that we really read in the press is how much they specifically liked working with you in some of these budget deals. So I guess I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit on what parts of the Republican shift do you think are real and significant on economic policy? There are people like J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio who are talking about the economy in ways that are different. You alluded to labor unions, right? They talk about corporate concentration as being worrisome. They come at it from a different perspective from progressives, but sometimes the policies are the same. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how this more populist Republican Party, which is clearly torn over this issue, but the wing of it that is kind of more interested in having government helping working people, what parts of that do you think, hey, I can work with that? And what parts of that are you like, I'm not really sure that's a substantive change?
I mean, the rhetoric can sound the same, but you dig a little, you're like, where legislation's needed, you start to see fundamental differences that make competition, you know, some of the trade actions, some of the things are, you know, our Department of Justice had gone after some of the consolidations. You see a lot of Republicans support things like that. Tech, Hawley, Cruz, supportive of a lot of things, you know, FTC and others have done. It's a nugget. Do I think it's fundamental change in the Republican Party? I don't. It's a few of them, and you see the infighting with them. It's not a. I don't think it's a large enough to see some of the substantive legislation that needs to happen. We've been close on some of the competition things, but not quite. We don't quite have the coalition to, you know, Klobuchar is a leader here, and she's worked for Republicans to try to get that kind of legislation. Look, I'm also a believer in you can disagree and people should have values. And I tell people you should not compromise your values. But there's different values in legislation. Try to find the pieces that work and you can agree to. But there's some things we're just not going to accept, and they're not going to accept. And the question is, do you walk out the room or do you try to find the pieces and put it together? And there's some stuff we're close to, child tax credit. There was a bill went through the House.
Yep.
Like, people are shocked by that. Jason Smith led that coalition. He is not seen as a liberal. He's a very conservative member from Missouri, head of the tax writing policy. He passed a bill and got the House to pass a bill that would bring back large portions of the child tax credit. It's combined with corporate taxes, and we run into a wall in the Senate. So there are nuggets.
Why the wall in the Senate?
I will tell you, some people have said the quiet thing out loud. It's an interesting reason. You know, they'll say it's opposition, child tax credit, people stay home, they don't work. I don't know how you can be opposed to something that brought down poverty in this country when children 40%. I don't know how you explain that to people. Every constituency, especially for senators, has a significant amount of poor kids. I don't even think that's the crux of the wall. I think, and a couple of people have said it, they don't want to set the precedent of paying for tax cuts. This bill actually pays for tax cuts, the ones that go to corporations and the ones that help children. We found an offset we could all agree to.
What were they, the offsets?
EITC, it was something everyone agreed had outlived its usefulness. So it wasn't controversial. But think about it, we have a big debate coming, whether or not to extend the 2017 or also known as Trump tax cuts. If you set a precedent that maybe tax cuts are spending, and you should pay for them if you're worried about our fiscal path, this sets a precedent I think some of them don't want to set. And it's a shame. We can't get this bill done because people are looking at the strategy of like, oh my God, if we start treating tax cuts like they actually add to the deficit and the debt, we can't ever pass big tax cuts again. Because we were told these tax cuts in 2017 would pay for themselves. They didn't. They did not. So I think that's a lot of what's going on.
So you mentioned inflation, which is clearly one of the president's challenges. It's also an issue all around the world, right? Inflation. Let me raise another one of the president's challenges, which is immigration. One of the things, you're obviously not directly involved in immigration, but you're the budget director, so you touch everything in your job.
I tried to tell people I have nothing to do with this, and then they point out that I do on something,
So President Biden he campaigned with very welcoming rhetoric about immigration. He took office and immediately changed some policies to make the country more welcoming. We, within really weeks of him taking office, saw an enormous surge of people trying to get into the United States, and many of them getting in. Many Americans are unhappy about that. You look at polls, people are unhappy about that. Speaking of budget, you talk to mayors and governors here in Colorado, in Denver, in Chicago, in New York, many of them Democrats, border communities, El Paso. People say, we just can't do this. And now the president has announced a new executive order that really tightens things. When I look at this history, I look at it and say, coming into office, the administration went further to loosen the immigration system than it ultimately decided was wise and has since tried to pull back. I'm guessing you don't share that frame, but I want to give you
I don't share that frame. I mean, there's a difference between separating women from their children, which I, as a mom find, as a country, we should all have some problem with that, and saying we are overwhelmed, and unless you come in a certain way, you can't come in. And that is a balance. To me, talk about the moral compass, there's a difference. And the president walking back from some of the worst things on day one was absolutely the right thing to do, and we're not apologizing about that. Over time, clearly, more and more people came that overwhelmed a lot of communities beyond. And we do have to also talk about the games played in some of the border states. We've never seen governors put people on buses, like in the most inhumane way, and send people to places they didn't even know where they were going. Trying to create political headaches with people's lives and sending them to places. So a lot of politics also trying to exacerbate a human problem and make it a political problem. The president understands, there's a lot of concern of being overwhelmed. We have to find an orderly way. We are a country of immigrants. We have to find an orderly way to keep that promise of America, but do it in a way we can absorb. And I think the president has found a way. The executive order has brought down illegal crossings by about 40%. We've seen today. He did something about it. Not with the help. We had a Senate bipartisan deal that fell apart because people put politics over finding a solution to the problem. You have to call that stuff out, and sometimes we don't. Democrats love governing. We love to do the right thing. We have to remind people. We tried to do something about it, and we had the most substantive immigration change at our fingertips, and we lost it because of politics. This executive order is as far as we could do by ourselves, and we're seeing results. But remember, the president has also reminded people we are a country of immigrants by extending benefits to spouses of immigrants. Recently, making sure that our DACA students who have, I thought we would find a solution, a bipartisan solution to make that program permanent, that we have done as much as possible to ensure that they don't lose status. So we can do both. We can have a stronger policy on the border that we've seen has worked, but also help bring immigrants who are here out of the shadows. Who thinks the draw isn't work and providing a better life? Like, you know, there is clearly a need also from an economic standpoint. And the challenge has always been making sure those numbers make sense for our country, and that we aren't overwhelmed, and being humane. And I think humane has to remain like in the centerpiece, and I think the president has struck that balance. Now, from our standpoint on funding, we can do some of it, but we need extra resources. We've made the case over and over, and people almost don't believe me. We've been turned down every time by Republicans in Congress.
You mean judges and border agents and
immigration judge teams, asylum officers. If you think it's ridiculous that people come to the country and don't have asylum hearing for 7 years, we agree. But maybe we need more asylum officers to process people. You know, people, not everybody, but there are some people who choose to break the system in order to point to everybody, like, see, it's broken. Well, you helped break it. You didn't fund it. You didn't, sit down and try to come to some bipartisan solution. So we're doing all we can, but frankly, I'm worried about our resources, especially if the executive orders are challenged. What happens if we don't have enough people to run an immigration system that most Americans expect? We don't have enough people to do what needs to be done to ensure we have an orderly immigration system. And people know that, which is why it's extra frustrating that we can't find. There's stuff Republicans asked for 10 years ago, I can't get them to do now. And it's very troubling. It's all political.
It's really striking to me, the 7 months. I mean, to me, I understand what I'm about to say may sound harsh, but a country where we say, you come here, we give you an asylum hearing, and after 2 weeks we say, you don't qualify, you have to leave.
Yeah.
That is a necessary part of a functional immigration system. A country where we say, after 7 years we're going to give you an asylum hearing and then kick you out feels inhumane.
A slip of paper. Yeah, you are ingrained into your system, into your community.
Right.
Your kids are going to school. They know no other country than here. This humane question, it's inhumane, it's inefficient, and it's just wrong. And we know how to fix it, but it takes resources. And people have chosen, again, to choose politics rather than building a system we know that works.
What's interesting to me is whatever disagreement we may have about the shortcomings of the president's early policy, he has landed in a place where he seems to be saying, we're going to get tougher about who can come in. We're also going to do more to help the people who are here.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more things before we open it up. Let's imagine a world in which the president wins re-election. These Democratic Senate candidates, who actually are doing really well in the polls, I know you say you don't do politics, they win, and the Democrats...
The ethics lawyer says I don't do politics.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's imagine a world in which President Biden is re-inaugurated on January 20th, 2025, and he has narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate. It's not the most likely scenario. It's also not a remote scenario. It really is a scenario that could happen. And so, and then let's imagine you all are sitting down and you want to pass the budget that puts the United States on a path to a fiscally responsible country. What does that look like? I think it looks like pretty substantial tax increases on corporations and wealthy people, but you tell me, and what else does it look like? Are there places you want to cut the budget and cut spending, or at least reduce growth? What is your vision and the president's vision of a fiscally responsible United States of America?
Well, I think there's a third leg we sometimes forget. They're actually spending that could help grow the economy. that also helps put us on a better fiscal path. So revenue, spending, to me, what spending can create a larger pie? I think about childcare. You know, we see numbers on a page, and we don't necessarily make our investment decisions based on what can help grow the economy. I want as many people in the labor force as possible. As a mother of a young child, it is not possible without affordable, quality childcare. You know, I met with Canadians, a few of the ministers. They have provinces, not as many states as they have provinces, but they worked, their federal government, their provinces worked to bring universal child care. They had to ask a little more, they're wealthy in the country, but that helps everybody. It gives those same corporate leaders access to workers they wouldn't normally have. So, you know, I do think we have to have a more complex conversation about what our investments are. And to the goal of expanding, having a more expansive economy and bringing more people in the workforce who haven't. We've done a good job. I mean, we're at unemployment that is hard to beat. You always have some unemployment built into the system. But we can always do better. We always bring more people who have historically not been in the workforce into the workforce. You know, Social Security and Medicare, you've heard the president talk about it, like hands off, not while he is here. And people are like, but that's where all the spending is. We can also do a better job on what we spend on health care. Doesn't mean taking benefits away. It means look at what we pay for the same health care other people in the world get. Pay too much. There are inefficiencies built in. We can do more to ensure that, like negotiating prescription drug benefits, we finally got, why are we paying so much for the same health care and worse outcomes than a lot of countries? So it isn't necessarily cutting benefits, it's doing more of that stuff. You talked earlier, we don't live as long as
Yes.
other developed nations. There's something bothersome to me about, you know, some people don't think it's a benefit cut, saying, you just like keep working till you're 70. It's also some inequity built in. Not every race, gender lives the same amount of time. So, you know, I don't get to enjoy my grandkids. Like, there's just something inherently wrong with at least let's call it what it is. It is a benefit cut. We have to acknowledge not everyone lives as long as other people, and we're taking away, you know, what we found important in this country, golden years, when we have that conversation. And that's why this president's laid down the marker. We have to look at some other ways to ensure we're on a better fiscal path. Defense is sacrosanct. We spend probably, at this point, if you don't include the supplementals to Ukraine, $900 billion. So, you know, we end up focusing on, with spending cuts, non-defense discretionary. People's like, yep, cut that. It's 13% of what we spend. It doesn't put you on a better fiscal path. It cuts Head Start. And it cuts NIH and biomedical research. No one wants that. You're like, let me list the things that are non-defense. You want to cut that? Veterans? No. You want to cut like that? No.
Farm.
Yeah. You want to cut farm subsidy, farm bill? Absolutely not. So we just need to have an honest dialogue. Like, Republicans also like spending. We may not like the same things or to the same degree. So what can we do? We're going to have a revenue conversation. I'd also like to have what makes sense from an investment standpoint. I don't think we do a perfect job. We probably make too many political decisions on what we spend on, and we need to have more of an evidence-based, fact-based on what is good for the economy and spending. And that's a hard redo of how we make funding decisions in Washington.
Really briefly before I call on folks, you're a photographer.
I do like to I would not call me a photographer.
You take photographs.
I do.
What do you like about it? What does it teach you? How does it either let you step away from your day job, or what does it teach you that makes you better at your job?
I don't know. I like it. It's pretty. And I get to, like, when people come in and they're like, oh, that's nice. I'm like, I took it. It's like this surprising little factoid. And I'm really, like, people go, you're not boring. You're the budget person, you're not boring. The administrator brought our astronauts in to have a conversation. They're the next going to the moon, a diverse group of astronauts. They're really inspiring for the country. You think about your government, you forget, like, we send people to the moon, like that is your government. And we do a lot of these things for various reasons. People have a lot of national pride, which is a good thing for the government. And they were like, you're not bored. I'm like, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Because I don't do math. Like, you're like, numbers. I do numbers. But these things are more of a political conversation. Like, each of these programs, you better know who the advocates are. And, therefore, it's hard to have that, like, lofty conversation about what the right, because everything has a constituency. And that's what I said. It'd be nice to see if there's a way to make decisions without the individual politics. We probably make some different decisions, but that is a hard, and I don't think I've been around when we've tried to have that level of conversation. So not necessarily a cutting exercise, but a reprioritization to things that are economic drivers more than this helps me over here.
Yeah. Okay. I've had a monopoly on questions. We're going to try to get a bunch in right here in the front. Please, I'd ask you to make it a question and make it nice and succinct so I can get to a bunch of you.
Of course. First of all, thank you for your service. Greatly appreciate it. You are not boring, and OMB is one of the most exciting things in government. I'm sorry, I just have to say it. So thank you.
We need to work on whatever you're doing in your free time.
Well, that goes to my question, which is, public service is so hard right now. We have a younger generation that's struggling with hope. What is your message to those who might not necessarily be interested in public service, but who might be perfectly suited to it? How do we get them over the line?
I'm really pissed off. If you are interested in one of these jobs, you look at, like, some of the stuff on social media said about appointees, or look at confirmation. I'm a house girl. I had no idea what confirmations were. You go to the Senate, it's like, I have no public record. I was a staffer, and, like, you're like, ooh, no, I'm in the lion's den, people turning, things you thought were innocuous. And I do think it's a turnoff for people who are well-suited for government. And that's why people like me, like, I try to do a lot of talking to young people, like, come. I think AI, the government's not going to get AI right without getting talent. And sometimes the best of the best there, they would be happy to serve in government. We've got to make it easier for them to get in. We do have some programs on the tech side, because we recognize we were making it too difficult for people to come serve their government. But I hope people don't give up and see. Hopefully people like myself, I've never run for office, but we need people not to give up on the system. This larger ideal of democracy. If we don't get the best and brightest in, like, what are people going to think about their government? And that worries me. And again, I think there are some people who know that. I worry people are going to choose not to when they hear some of the rhetoric and hear some of the things people go through on social media. And you forget, people have families, they have parents. It is really difficult to see stuff. I've had senators tell me, don't take it personal. Like, they voted no. I like you, but I had a race, yada, yada, yada. I was like, you said no next to my name. It's personal. It's personal. And that's unfortunate. That has changed since I've gotten to Washington. And I'm worried about it. And that's one of the things many of us who are in service Democrats and Republicans, have to figure out how to make people know that there are a rational governing majority out here who want their government to work.
The short version is, it's not boring and it matters. That's the case for
It's not boring and it matters. But I have to convince people to ignore the worst.
Yes, yeah. No, and it's real, and a lot of it's really bad. Right back here, thanks.
Thank you so much for your service. You were talking about how the immigration system is unfunded and broken, and I think it's so important that we get that message out there. What's the next thing from your perspective in government that is being underfunded, that's kind of broken that the public needs to know about? The next biggest
He's
thing.
like,
Just one.
we don't have time. I will tell you the one thing I fought hardest for in this last budget cycle, and we've never had to fight for before. We ended up getting it, but we shouldn't have had to put that much effort, and it's the WIC program. Great success for the government. For the first time last year, we were threatened to be underfunded, and women and children would have been turned around. And we had to pull out the comm stops, and remind people what this was. It was one of the few bipartisan things. And yes, usage grew. And it cost more, but no one ever thought that there was a constituency who were well, we don't have the money to fully fund it. People won't get access, and so that was even those third rail, the things that were never problems. Now we can't ignore those programs that always had bipartisan support. So it's always something new. The thing I think is going to be a problem in a budget cycle, it's always something else.
Yeah.
Things like homeland security, that's always difficult. But it's a refreshing new list of problems every year in my world.
So do we have someone in the back?
Who are you going to give the mic to? You have a hard job with this mic.
Thank you for your service. We all know about the Israel-Hamas war. We have heard about the tensions between North and South Korea. Russia has ships off the Cuban coast. How should Americans be taking all of this? And I guess my question to the administration is the proper messaging going out? Should we be more concerned? I know there is a lot going on right now as it relates to the presidential election, but should we be focusing a little bit more on what's happening potentially here domestically? We have all these things going on around us, and so I guess I'm just curious, are we getting proper messaging here at home, and can we do a better job of communicating with Americans about exactly what's going on and how it impacts us domestically?
Well, I think the good news is you just told me a lot of the threats. So there's transparency. The media deserves a lot of credit for that. I think the question boils down to, should the administration tell people these things and the confluence of these mean they should worry more? I think you've not heard that because there's a plan for dealing with all of those. From my standpoint, I look at clearly our national defense from a funding standpoint. I do think defense funding remains one of the bipartisan things, making sure our military making sure it is not just from what can you buy, making sure the world sees that it remains one of the few places we have agreement on and is a deterrent. Don't come here. We are there. We are the invaluable nation. That's not just on diplomacy, but also knowing we have a force that can back it up. So I can't speak to the should we be messaging it differently, but from my standpoint, from a budgetary resource standpoint, we always find it is still one of the easier. We fight about little things, one of the easier things to come around, and we all want to ensure that the department is well resourced. Ukraine and the fight around funding for that. The largest thing was reminding Americans that was about our national security. And because of all the things that you talked about, we're in a complex world. Why would we take a step back from one of the largest conflicts between the West and authoritarianism we see in the world? It's not just there. These are our values. Which system is going to win here? So everything you said, this complex world, I think would have sent an awful message if we could not have found bipartisan consensus to stay with our friends in Ukraine. I visited Ukraine 3 times when I was a staffer in Congress with Republican staffers, because we all took a lot of pride in, after Crimea, starting to provide security assistance. So something went wrong, clearly, you know, in some of the people who want to pull away. But I think exactly for the things you cited, to me, that was the exact thing I'd push members on. Like, the complex world requires that America stay in this and show that we're not going to shirk away. People are waiting for us to pull back. And if you think they aren't going to find us somewhere else, you're wrong. And it's not just about Ukraine, it's about all the things you just talked about.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for doing
Thank
this.
you.